You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host, Ankit Panda from New York City.
And this is Prashant Parmaswaran from Washington, D.C.
How are you doing today, Prashant?
Good. How are you doing?
Doing well. And it's not just the two of us today. We actually have a third special guest with us. Joining us all the way from Australia is Hervé Lemaille, Director of the Asian Power and Diplomacy Program at the Lowy Institute. Hervé, how are you doing today?
I'm doing very well. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure. I always like to have our guests introduce themselves since they usually do a much better job of stating what they're actually interested in than I can do on their behalf. So do you mind telling us a bit about what you work on at the Lowy Institute?
Sure. So I head a program that is responsible for a comprehensive assessment of the distribution of power in Asia. And we look at everything from military capability to defense diplomacy, cultural influence, and economic relationships. But my background is mainly on Southeast Asia. I focused on political economy and security. Before coming to the Lowy Institute, I was at the IISS, which is another think tank in London. I also grew up in Myanmar, so I have a special sort of focus and interest in the politics and history of the Mekong region in particular.
Terrific. Well, you're right at home on this podcast with me and Prashant. And so actually, so some of our listeners might remember, especially if you've been listening to this podcast for more than a year, about a year ago, Prashant and I did an episode looking at the product that Hervé's team at the Lowy Institute put out. Of course, we didn't have Hervé on the podcast with us back then, but this was the Asia Power Index, which Hervé briefly hinted at with his description of what he does at Lowy. And the latest edition is out, the 2019 edition, and what the index does, I'll just briefly introduce it, Hervé, but then you can take us in a little bit deeper, is basically rank orders 25 countries in the Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific region across a range of indicators, basically giving a quantitative ranking of their total power. Obviously, that's an important part of the currency of international relations, and certainly on a geopolitical podcast, we're very interested in how such a ranking or methodology works. So, Hervé, do you want to just tell us a bit, before we dig into the specific rankings and some of the interesting takeaways from this year's ranking, tell us a bit about the methodology behind this ranking and how you really, came up with it. And how, honestly, at the end of the day, how do you have the confidence to give these 25 countries the rankings that you do? It just seems like a daunting task. But I think you do it well here.
Well, thanks very much. I think Professor Ewan Kong at Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy put it most diplomatically. He said, you guys have a lot of gumption in terms of trying to assess power. We always talk about the balance of power in very abstract terms. Yet there's a lack, or there's a deficit of more data-based approaches at trying to measure shifts in the distribution of power over time. We felt that was a challenge that we wanted to take, and as much as possible try to bring some data points to the equation. So we undertake a very comprehensive assessment of power. It's not just hard power, but it's also soft power. And we have about 126 indicators in the index, 30,000 data points. And the idea is that we're trying to build an analytical tool that will engage users at all levels of the index. So most indices are built as sort of black boxes that spit out a magic number. We come up with a final ranking, but we also invite people to question our assumptions and the component parts of the index. We want people to engage with individual indicators. We even have a weightings calculator that allows us, or anyone really, to reshuffle the weightings, the relative importance of different measures of power, which will recalibrate the rankings. So this is basically trying to clarify the terms of the debate here, as opposed to coming up with a empirically conclusive answer. But essentially, the big thing that we're trying to establish is that power is more than what countries have. It's also what countries decide to do with what they have. So it's nice to have a large economy, but you need to be investing in strategically pivotal countries. It's good to have a large military, but you need to be investing in defense diplomacy. And that really revolves around policy, around choices and initiative, not just the fact that power is your resources or the sum of your resources. And we try to reflect the fact that power in the 21st century really hinges on networks and interdependence and asymmetries in relationships. So we've tried to establish basically a digital platform that's available for free, power.lowinstitute.org, where you can see the relative strengths and weaknesses of every country. And what we have established for a second year is that the US remains the predominant player in Asia. It is actually still quite significant that the most powerful country in Asia is not actually an Asian country, it's the US. Nevertheless, in 2019, we think that the US has underachieved and that the power differential between the US and China has narrowed. And we also think that the Indo-Pacific is made up of many other actors. So there are many actors that create and sustain the balance of power, which is why we felt the need to include up to 25 countries. So we go as far west as Pakistan, as far north as Russia, and as far into the South Pacific as Australia and New Zealand.
Terrific. Prashant, I'll let you ask a question here.
No, I think first of all, I wanted to say, I mean, this is a very useful tool because I think, as you said, Hervé, I mean, we have conversations about power and debates and discussions about it all the time, but it really is useful to have a digital and interactive platform in front of us that can help frame the debate so that even if we disagree on certain aspects, we at least have a common point of reference and a very comprehensive one too. Looking at not just the resources these countries have, as you said, but also the influence that they can project. I think one of the things that was, I mean, I was waiting to sort of get my hands on this because it's the first year where, since it's the second year of production, where we could actually see, you know, the extent of continuity and change with respect to these rankings and how far these countries have come. One of the things that struck me was that when you looked at the countries that were either improving or worsening in terms of their rankings, the improved scores, I think you had China was plus 1.4, North Korea plus 1.3, and then the downward trajectory was also quite a small increase, relatively speaking. I mean, what does that say about the ranking system? I think one aspect of this is that it's a very comprehensive index, so not surprising that you don't see dramatic changes from year to year, but what does that say in terms of the amount of improvement and the downward trends, the fact that these are very small margins?
Yeah, so I think what that tells us is that we wouldn't expect Cambodia to suddenly become a major power overnight. And that sort of makes sense. We're talking about tectonic shifts, almost generational in scope, in the relative power of different players in our region. So we're going to have to repeat this exercise over many years before we start seeing real changes. I mean, the only real substantive change to the rankings this year was in terms of North Korea having overtaken the Philippines, now the 16th most powerful country in our region, and that sort of reflects both its signature strengths as a nuclear power, the gumption that it has in terms of negotiating directly with the United States, but also real weaknesses still in terms of having a smaller economy than Laos, even though a country like Laos has a quarter of the population of North Korea. So this is an asymmetric power. But I think what it shows us generally is the trends seem to be moving in the direction of emerging economies, which makes sense. Asia's economic transformation is really changing the balance of power globally and changing the way the region works strategically and politically. What it also confirms is that the US is not in absolute decline by any sense. It remains the predominant military player. It has unprecedented levels of defense clout in our region. It also brings soft power to the region in terms of information flows and cultural influence. But that it may, it is facing up to relative decline with the rise of all these other players. And that includes China, but it also includes a number of interesting major powers like India, established powers like Japan, who in the void, I would say, or in the absence of broad-based US political leadership in a multilateral sense, have really taken the initiative to shore up support for a rules-based multilateral order. So what we're seeing is that middle powers are having to work harder than they ever have before to maintain their comparative advantage. And a primary example of that is Prime Minister Shinzo Abe of Japan and the way that he was able to resuscitate the Trans-Pacific Partnership minus the United States. So middle powers are taking the initiative here. And I think it's too simplistic to reduce geopolitics in Asia as a two-player game between the US and China. There's a lot more happening here. Even ASEAN countries, as much as we criticize ASEAN for being a not particularly adept tool of diplomacy in an age of great power competition, in fact, 8 out of 10 ASEAN countries registered upward trends in their score, which is interesting, right? I mean, we sort of think that as we enter into a turbulent age of great power relations, that everyone else becomes less important. But I actually think that middle powers become more important in the overall balance of power as we enter into a period where we're moving from consensual world order to one defined again by competition and zero-sum politics. So networks still matter, and I think that actually counterintuitively, middle powers are actually becoming more important, not less important, to the balance of power.
Yeah, I mean that's really struck out to me, the improvement among so many of the Southeast Asian countries. But also, I mean, just looking at this also struck me last year, just the power levels that many American allies and partners bring to the table, right? I mean, that's when you think about a networked Indo-Pacific, those advantages that the United States actually has in the region, which I know that's part of the measure, the defense networks that a country has. Is sort of taken into account in the measure of U.S. power inherently, but that really, I think, comes through in the index. So a quick question that I had on, I guess this is kind of a methods question. So with Russia, is Russia's power score based on, at least when it comes to hard power and relationships, is that based comprehensively on everything Russia does on the global stage or what it does exclusively in Asia?
So this is an index that's primarily focused on the relationships that countries have within Asia and their ability to project their interests within the Indo-Pacific region. So it gives us great pleasure in Australia to describe Russia as a middle power and not as a major power. I think it's a reflection of the fact that whilst Russia is a Eurasian power and it does have significant military assets in our region, its Pacific Fleet is based in Vladivostok. Predominantly, it is still a sort of European player. It's much more active in Eastern Europe and even in the Middle East than it is in Asia. It has its own pivot to Asia. It's become very important to China, particularly as China's energy security trends downwards. It's having to rely much more on Russia to diversify its access to secure energy. But other than that, I think Russia is basically an underachiever in our region and doesn't seem to allocate as many resources or policy priority to Asia. And I think our ranking of Russia in 5th place behind India is a reflection of that.
Right. So that was the hunch that I actually had, that Russia's showing was a function of the fact that this was primarily focused on the Asian power angle of a country like Russia. I was wondering, so in the future, actually, has there been any thought of adding, I guess, further extra-regional powers? I'm thinking here of, France and the UK in particular. Hervé, we just saw you at the Shangri-La Dialogue, where this was obviously a big topic of contention, because I think that would actually be an interesting addition to the index to actually think about how those countries and possibly the European Union, if that can be done for a supranational organization like that, how they express themselves in the Indo-Pacific in terms of power.
So I had the pleasure of briefing the German defense minister on the Asia Power Index back in January, and they were very interested in exactly that, in seeing how other extra-regional powers could contribute one way or the other to the balance of power in Asia. And that's something that we would hope to work towards in the future. So we're at the moment, the focus is very much on the Indo-Pacific, and that's predominantly a sort of a maritime construct. But what we want to do more of is focused on Central Asia. So we go as far as Mongolia, but we could do things like Kazakhstan, countries like Kazakhstan and the other stands, and even then move into the direction of the European Union. And the French as well have told me under no uncertain terms that they are a major Indo-Pacific player, that they are a nuclear power, that they hold a Security Council seat, and therefore they deserve as well to be considered under this index. I think I'd like to do that. That presents some methodological questions as well, because we've got to differentiate between France or the EU's power within their regions versus what they are actually doing in the Indo-Pacific. But as this methodology matures, as the index, as we repeat this exercise over time, the idea is to add a number of other players and see how they're contributing to the balance of power. I mean, one thing that I wanted to add as well is that some people have said, look, you're offering a very somewhat fatalist interpretation of the way that the balance of power inevitably is shifting towards the largest players like China. And that's true to a certain extent. I mean, the economic balance of power does determine a lot of the final rankings. But at the same time, nothing is predetermined, and because we're making this distinction between power being more than the sum of your economic resources, being the sum of your policy initiatives and your networks, I actually think this is a much more fluid arrangement than conventionally thought. And what we're sort of suggesting is that the US will find it increasingly difficult to compete with China unilaterally. So there's a kind of leveling effect in the respective powers that they have as individual countries. But the future is networked. It has to be. And the comparative advantage that the US still holds over China will lie in taking a networked approach. And under those circumstances, middle powers in Asia, but also as far as Europe, become much more crucial to the overall balance of power. And I think one of the key challenges for China is actually establishing broad-based influence. There's no doubt that China has this incredible economic soft power, although there are increasing questions as to the sustainability of current levels of lending and whether that kind of economic soft power is translating to influence in other domains. We've seen increased levels of opposition towards China's Belt and Road Initiative, for example, in Southeast Asia over the course of the last 12 months. We've had countries like Malaysia and Myanmar renegotiate their big flagship BRI projects in favor of the borrower. And at the same time, if you're then looking at the underlying demographics, you have the rise of India, right? By mid-century, India will be about 20% larger than China demographically. China is set to lose 158 million people from its working age population in less than 30 years. That's going to presage all forms, all manner of social and economic challenges. So there is nothing actually predetermined. And as China chips away or continues to chip away at the relativities of the US's power, I actually think that India will start doing the same for China's power. And there is just going to be just a much more general leveling effect between the top players and everyone else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one of the things that did strike me about the index findings again this year was the fact that, I mean, as you said, Hervé, I mean, this is a sort of a region with various players beyond just the United States and China. That being said, though, I mean, the data, it is quite striking, not surprising, but if you look at it visually and you look at the metrics, how the United States and China, how far ahead they are relative to even India and Japan, right? Right. And the fact that you have these increases that, as we discussed earlier, are happening so incrementally and slowly, it didn't seem like we were, going to be headed for a multipolar world in the true sense of the word, in terms of comprehensive notions of power anytime soon. Even though these countries will obviously sort of form their own networks in response to what the United States and China do. I also do think, the point about networking is reinforced in the index by the fact that, I mean, Taiwan, was, in fact, penalized by the index in terms of going down because partly because at least coercive attempts by China and the fact that it's lost some of its diplomatic allies. So the fact that the networking power of these countries is demonstrated in the index, relatively speaking, right? Whereas I think China, in terms of defense networks, which was very interesting, still ranks quite low, but it went up, I think, 3 spots in terms of its networks, and that was very interesting for me because it is interesting with the Belt and Road Initiative that the Chinese are not only using this as an economic initiative, but also a way to build up their geopolitical influence more generally.
Yeah, I think that's a good observation. We have to take that in perspective. I mean, yes, China did climb the ranks in terms of our assessment of its defense diplomacy, and that is the area where it made the most progress over the last 12 months. But it is still the Achilles heel of China's influence in our region, the fact that it's only ranked 9th, which is well below where it should stand, given that it comes out second for the overall ranking. And what we do there is essentially we're looking at conventional alliances, so that the U.S.-centered alliance network, the hub and spoke, where the U.S. is the hub and the spokes are Australia and South Korea and Japan. But we're also looking at non-allied defense partnerships, and we think that that's actually the main medium of defense diplomacy in our region, given that a lot of countries are formally non-aligned, but they are doing a lot behind the scenes. So how do you measure the depth of emerging defense relationships? Well, we look at the number of joint training exercises that countries undertake and with whom. So we're looking at the diversity, but also the depth of their relationships. We're looking at the defense diplomacy dialogues that take place in the region and between which countries. We're looking at arms transfers as well, which is often a sort of a proxy indicator of hardening strategic partnerships. And what we see is that China is sort of normalizing a little bit. So it has climbed the ranks, but it hasn't done so with any particular country in mind. It's just generally undertaking a few more joint training exercises than it was 2 years ago. The PLA celebrated a big anniversary this year as well, so that would have actually counted towards the joint training exercises with other countries. So in some sense, it's trying to lift the profile and trying to normalize the relationships that the PLA has with the rest of the region. But really fundamentally, most of the defense diplomacy that takes place in our region is still geared towards hedging against the rise of China as a military actor. And I would actually even say there's an inverse relationship between China's military strength and the fact that it's growing in its military capability and the amount of effort that goes into defense diplomacy by everyone else to try to hedge against China's rise. And this is, it points to a sort of trust deficit in the long-term ambitions of Beijing. We'll have to see. I mean, perhaps China will continue to make similar strides in its defense diplomacy, but for the moment, I would say, it's certainly worthy of a mention. But the overall picture is still one in which China looks very isolated in terms of its defense diplomacy.
So, am I right in saying that the second largest growth year on year in power in the Lowy Power Index this year is North Korea after China?
That's correct. Yes.
That's pretty interesting.
Yes. It is, yes. So, I mean, it's absolutely fascinating because North Korea actually jumped 1.3 points, which is almost the same scale as what China's upward trend was. So I have to say there's a score that's based out of 100 points, and then there's a ranking based on the score. So North Korea jumped in ranking, and it also jumped 1.3 points in its overall score. And that really has everything to do with the kind of clever diplomacy of Kim Jong-un over the last 12 months. The fact that I think North Korea has played a weak hand very well over the course of 2018 and 2019. By engaging in this summit diplomacy in Singapore and in Vietnam, ostensibly on equal terms with the President of the United States, Kim Jong-un has managed to elevate the standing of North Korea and even partially normalize North Korea's diplomatic relations with the rest of the region. Now, that's still very far from normalizing or relaxing the sanctions regime against North Korea. That's really what North Korea wants here, after all, is to sort of integrate into the global economy. But we can talk about a relaxation in the enforcement of those sanctions. And that's forced us to kind of have another fresh look at our projections for North Korea's economic progress in the next 10 years. And we've actually, our new forecast is painting a slightly rosier picture for North Korea, starting from a very low base. But therefore, it's made the most kind of strides in terms of its diplomatic influence, where it's jumped 5 rankings. And in terms of its future resources. But this is an incomplete gamble. There's a lot that could still go wrong here. And I'd say that, North Korea has made huge strides, but it's coming from a low base.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'll be really curious to see where North Korea ends up next year.
I mean, the other thing to mention, sorry, about North Korea is that at the same time that it's made these strides in terms of its influence metrics, it's also continued to do very well in military capability. It's jumped 1 ranking there. And it's, there are estimates that it's produced as much nuclear fissile material to build, I think, something like a dozen new nuclear bombs since the summit diplomacy started with Donald Trump. So the point is, its hard power is as unabated as ever.
That's right. So we are running a little short on time, Hervé, but I wanted to ask you, I know there's so much more depth to the power index than we can really capture in our brief format here. But is there anything you want to punch up for our listeners before we unfortunately have to end today's episode?
Just on, I think Taiwan offers a very curious example of a sort of a political outsider that's still central to the balance of power in our region. So Taiwan is the only country that registered, or the only territory rather, that registered a significant downward shift in our assessment of its power. That's because it's lost more diplomatic allies over the last 12 months. It's lost 2 countries that previously recognized it as the main China, but it is up on technology and it's up on defense diplomacy. So even in this, in our assessment, there are silver linings here. And I think we have to remember Taiwan is still a really important check to China's ambitions to become a full-fledged maritime power. So long as Taiwan continues to exist as an autonomous territory, that is still a very big obstacle for China's rise.
Terrific. Prashant, any final impressions?
No, I think this was great. Good addition, and I'm looking forward to seeing how this plays out next year with the addition of the indicators. I would just flag one additional interesting anecdote that I saw reflected, which is the index and the findings. Hervé and his team noted that one of the sources of American influence with respect to its capabilities is the fact that even though the United States remains an outside actor with respect to the Asia Pacific, the place that a lot of folks are still getting their news about Asia is actually from U.S. sources, in addition to, of course, the Diplomat magazine and other sources that we're familiar with. And I thought that was really interesting, too, because the media environment plays an important role in shaping some of these indicators as well, including the sort of cultural indicators and social indicators.
Right. No, so, I mean, I think that's the real strength of the Lowy Index is that it's there's so much more to power than military capabilities, which is, I think, really worth pointing out. I mean, we can talk all we want about hardware, and especially something like nuclear weapons. I think it's fascinating how little that does for some countries, like Pakistan especially finds itself kind of solidly in the middle order despite being a nuclear power. And of course, I think North Korea tends to punch above its weight precisely for that reason. So yeah, I mean, Hervé, commendations to you and your team for your work here. And I think Prashant hinted at this, but I think the real value of this index, I think, will be over the years as we observe countries move up and down and the reasons for those. So thanks a lot for joining us today to talk through your findings.
Thanks so much, Ankit and Prashant. I really enjoyed the opportunity to talk a bit more beyond just the headlines.
Yeah, and I'll just plug the URL again. So it's power.lowyinstitute.org. I really recommend our listeners go poke around the website because, like Hervé said, you can actually change things around, look at all the categories, and yeah, there's a lot of depth. I think the printed version that I have is well over 150 pages, just going through all the various permutations of power rankings in the index.
For the data geeks out there, it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, absolutely. So unfortunately, we'll have to end it there. I know that we could talk a lot longer about this stuff. But for our listeners, thanks a lot for tuning into the podcast. As always, if you like what you heard, make sure you subscribe. We're now on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, and a range of other podcast providers. I'm sure you can find one way or another to subscribe to the Asia Geopolitics podcast. And if you've been a subscriber for a while, but you haven't yet left us a review, please do that. It really helps get the word out about the show. So thanks. We will be back in a couple weeks. I'm actually taking a week off next week, so there won't be a podcast. But we will be back in late June to talk about the latest developments in the Asia Pacific. So thanks a lot for listening.